the dogs were supposed to kill. That's what they were trained to do. Starved, beaten, and conditioned to tear flesh from bone without hesitation. On a humid August night in 1847, at a remote plantation in the backwoods of northern Georgia, an overseer named Garrett Thorne gave an order that would echo through the county for generations. He commanded 4 enslaved people accused of attempting escape to be thrown into the kennels where the hunting dogs were kept. The plantation owner was away on business in Savannah, leaving Thorne in absolute control. What happened in those kennels defied every expectation. By dawn, the dogs had not attacked. Instead, they had done something that left even the most hardened witnesses speechless. The plantation's records were sealed. The overseer vanished within weeks, and the 4 enslaved people were never seen again. For over a century, the truth remained buried in whispered rumors and fragmented letters. But the full story, pieced together from forgotten journals, county archives, and testimonies recorded decades later, reveals a night that challenged everything the people of that time believed about loyalty, cruelty, and the boundaries of human compassion. Before we continue with the story of Garrett Thorne and the Harrove Plantation, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And let us know in the comments what state or city you are listening from. Now, let's uncover what really happened that night. The Harrove Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of dense Georgia pine forest and red clay fields, isolated from the nearest town by a full day's ride on horseback. It was a place where the outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. The main house, a 2-story structure with white columns and wide verandas, stood at the center of the property, surrounded by rows of slave quarters, tobacco barns, and storage sheds. Beyond the cultivated fields lay thick woods where wild hogs roamed and the air hung heavy with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. The plantation was owned by Samuel Hargrove, a man in his late 50s who had inherited the land from his father and expanded it through shrewd investments and ruthless efficiency. Hargrove was known throughout the county as a stern but calculating businessman. He rarely raised his voice, but his decisions were final. He spent much of his time traveling to Savannah and Charleston, negotiating tobacco contracts, and attending social gatherings with other wealthy landowners. In his absence, the day-to-day operations fell to Garrett Thorne. Thorne was a different breed of man entirely. Lean and sun-scorched with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl, he had worked his way up from a field hand on a neighboring plantation to the position of overseer through sheer brutality and an unshakable belief in his own authority. He carried a leather whip coiled at his belt and a pistol tucked into his waistband, and he used both liberally. The enslaved people on the Harrove Plantation feared him more than they feared Hargrove himself, because Thorne's cruelty was unpredictable and personal. He seemed to take pleasure in finding reasons to punish, in asserting his dominance over people who had no means to resist. Thorne had arrived at the Hargrove Plantation in the spring of 1845, recommended by another planter who praised his ability to maintain order and maximize productivity. Within weeks of his arrival, the atmosphere on the plantation had changed dramatically. Where Samuel Hargrove had been distant but relatively predictable, Thorne was present and volatile. He would appear without warning in the fields, watching the workers with cold, calculating eyes, looking for any sign of slackness or defiance. He instituted new rules. No talking during work hours, no gathering in groups larger than 3, no movement between the quarters and the fields without explicit permission. Violations were met with immediate and severe punishment. The enslaved population numbered approximately 60 people, ranging from young children to elderly men and women who had spent their entire lives in bondage. They lived in a cluster of rough wooden cabins near the tobacco barns, structures that provided minimal shelter from the elements and no privacy whatsoever. Each cabin housed multiple families, with thin walls that did nothing to muffle sound and gaps in the floorboards that let in cold air during the winter months. The cabins were arranged in 2 parallel rows, creating a narrow lane down the middle where children played during the brief moments of free time, and where adults gathered after the workday ended to share news and comfort. Among this population were 4 individuals who would become central to the events of that August night, a man named Jacob, a woman named Esther, and two younger men, Thomas and Samuel. Each had their own story, their own history of loss and survival, and each had learned to navigate the brutal realities of plantation life in their own way. Jacob was in his early 30s, though the hard years of labor had aged him beyond his years. He had been born on a plantation in Virginia, where his mother had worked in the main house as a cook, and his father had been a skilled blacksmith. Jacob had grown up with a degree of privilege unusual for an enslaved child. He had learned to read and write from the planter's children, who had treated him as a playmate during their early years, and he had been trained by his father in the basics of metalwork and carpentry. But when Jacob was 15, the planter had died, and the estate had been divided among his heirs. Jacob's family was split up and sold to different buyers. He never saw his parents again. He was purchased by a man named Richard Dalton, who owned a smaller plantation in the Virginia Piedmont. Dalton was a dog breeder and hunter, and he quickly recognized that Jacob had a natural affinity for animals. Jacob was assigned to work in the kennels, caring for Dalton's prized hunting dogs, blue tick hounds and redbone hounds that were used for tracking deer, bear, and occasionally runaway slaves. Jacob spent 5 years working with those dogs, learning their behaviors, understanding their needs, and developing a deep respect for their intelligence and loyalty. He learned that dogs responded not to violence, but to consistency, patience, and clear communication. He learned to read their body language, to recognize the subtle signs of fear or aggression, and to establish trust through gentle handling and regular care. But in 1842, Richard Dalton fell into debt and was forced to sell off portions of his property, including several of his enslaved workers. Jacob was sold to a trader who transported him south to Georgia, where he was purchased by Samuel Hargrove. The transition was devastating. Jacob had formed genuine bonds with the dogs he had cared for, and being separated from them felt like losing family all over again. On the Hargrove plantation, he was assigned to work as a carpenter, repairing buildings and constructing new structures as needed. It was skilled work, and Jacob was grateful for it. But he missed the dogs. He missed the quiet companionship they had provided, the sense of purpose he had felt in caring for them. Esther was older than Jacob, perhaps in her mid-40s, though she had long since stopped counting the years. She had been born on the Hargrove plantation, the daughter of a woman who had died in childbirth and a father she had never known. Esther had spent her entire life on this land, watching generations of enslaved people come and go, witnessing the cycles of planting and harvest, birth and death, hope and despair. She had given birth to 5 children over the years, but only 2 had survived past infancy, and both had been sold away when they reached adolescence. The pain of those losses had hardened something inside her. But it had also given her a fierce determination to survive, to endure, to find small moments of dignity and resistance in a system designed to strip her of both. Esther worked primarily in the fields, though she also served as an informal healer and midwife for the enslaved community. She had learned about medicinal plants from her mother and from other older women on the plantation, and she knew how to treat common ailments, fevers, infections, digestive problems, wounds. She kept a small garden behind her cabin where she grew herbs and roots. People came to her when they were sick or injured, trusting her knowledge more than they trusted the plantation's white doctor, who rarely visited and showed little interest in their well-being. Esther was also a keeper of stories. She remembered the names of people who had been sold away, the details of their lives, the circumstances of their departures. She remembered the old songs and prayers that had been passed down from earlier generations, and she taught them to the younger people, ensuring that the memories and traditions would not be lost. In this way, she served as a living archive of the plantation's history, a repository of knowledge and memory that existed outside the official records kept by Samuel Hargrove. Thomas and Samuel were brothers, both in their early 20s, born to a woman named Ruth who had died of pneumonia when they were teenagers. The brothers were inseparable, working side by side in the fields and sharing a corner of one of the cabins. They were strong and quick, often assigned to the most physically demanding tasks, clearing new land, hauling timber, digging drainage ditches. They had inherited their mother's quiet strength and her stubborn refusal to be completely broken by the system that held them captive. Thomas was the older of the two by about 18 months. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that were calloused and scarred from years of hard labor. He spoke rarely, preferring to communicate through gestures and expressions, but when he did speak, people listened. He had a reputation for fairness and level-headedness, and he often served as a mediator in disputes among the enslaved community. Thomas had once been whipped nearly to death by a previous overseer for refusing to strike another enslaved person who had been accused of stealing food. The scars on his back were a testament to his refusal to participate in the plantation's system of internal policing, and they had earned him a measure of respect among his peers. Samuel, the younger brother, was more talkative and outgoing. He had a quick wit and a talent for storytelling, and he often entertained the other workers during the brief rest periods with humorous anecdotes and observations. But beneath the humor was a deep anger, a simmering resentment that he worked hard to keep hidden from the overseers. Samuel had witnessed his mother's death, had held her hand as she struggled to breathe, and he had never forgiven the plantation for denying her proper medical care. He dreamed of escape, of freedom, of a life where he and his brother could make their own choices and live without fear. The summer of 1847 had been particularly harsh. The heat was relentless, with temperatures climbing into the high 90s day after day, and the humidity made the air feel thick and oppressive. The tobacco crop demanded constant attention, the plants had to be suckered, topped, and monitored for pests, and the work was backbreaking. Thorne drove the workers harder than usual, extending the workdays into the twilight hours and cutting rations as punishment for perceived laziness. He seemed to take particular pleasure in finding fault, in singling out individuals for public humiliation and punishment. Tension simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but palpable. The enslaved community had learned to communicate in subtle ways, through glances and gestures, through songs with coded meanings, through carefully chosen words that could be interpreted in multiple ways. It was during this time that whispers of escape began to circulate, not loud or reckless whispers, but quiet, cautious conversations held in the shadows of the quarters after the overseers had retired for the night. The idea of escape was not new. It was a constant undercurrent in the lives of enslaved people, a dream that sustained them through the worst moments, and a possibility that was always present, however remote. But planning an actual escape was extraordinarily dangerous. The plantation was isolated, surrounded by miles of dense forest and swampland. The nearest free state was hundreds of miles to the north. The journey would require traveling through hostile territory, avoiding slave patrols, and finding food and shelter along the way. The risks were enormous, and the consequences of failure were severe: public whipping, branding, sale to the deep south, or even death. But for Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, the dream of freedom had become more than just a distant hope. It had become a necessity, a goal worth risking everything to achieve. They began to meet in secret, late at night, when the rest of the plantation was asleep, gathering in a small clearing in the woods beyond the quarters. They spoke in hushed tones, planning routes, discussing strategies, and sharing information they had gathered from traders and travelers who passed through the area. Jacob contributed his knowledge of the surrounding terrain. During his years on the Dalton plantation in Virginia, he had accompanied hunting parties into the wilderness, and he had learned to read the landscape, to navigate by the stars, and to find water and shelter in the forest. He knew that the key to a successful escape was preparation and patience. They would need to gather supplies, choose the right moment, and move quickly once they committed to the plan. Esther brought her knowledge of medicinal plants and her understanding of the rhythms of plantation life. She knew when the overseers were most likely to be distracted, when the patrols were scheduled, and which routes through the woods were least likely to be monitored. She also served as a voice of caution, reminding the others of the risks and urging them to think carefully about every detail. Thomas and Samuel provided the physical strength and determination that would be essential for the journey. They were young and resilient, capable of enduring long periods of physical exertion, and they were willing to take risks that older or more cautious individuals might avoid. Samuel, in particular, was eager to move forward, to take action rather than simply talking about possibilities. But Garrett Thorne was not a man easily fooled. He had spent years learning to read the subtle shifts in behavior that signaled discontent or rebellion. He noticed when conversations stopped abruptly as he approached. He saw the way certain individuals avoided eye contact or moved with a new urgency. And he had informants, people who, out of fear or desperation, would trade information for small favors or the promise of leniency. One of these informants was a man named Peter, a middle-aged field hand who had been on the plantation for over 20 years. Peter had once been a strong and proud man, but years of brutal treatment had broken something inside him. He had learned that survival sometimes required making compromises, doing things that went against his own moral code. When Thorne approached him one evening and asked if he had heard any talk of escape plans, Peter hesitated for only a moment before telling him what he knew. Peter did not provide names at first. He spoke in vague terms about rumors and whispers, hoping that would be enough to satisfy Thorne without directly implicating anyone. But Thorne pressed him, threatening to reduce his rations and increase his workload if he did not provide more specific information. Faced with the prospect of even greater suffering, Peter gave in. He told Thorne about the late-night meetings in the woods, about the 4 people who seemed to be at the center of the planning, about the conversations he had overheard regarding routes and supplies. Thorne listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Peter finished speaking, Thorne nodded slowly and told him to return to his cabin and say nothing to anyone. Peter left, his shoulders hunched with shame and fear, knowing that he had betrayed his own people, but unable to see any other path forward. Thorne spent the next several days observing Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, watching their movements and interactions. He saw the way they glanced at each other across the fields, the way they seemed to communicate without words. He noticed that they often finished their assigned tasks quickly and then lingered near the edge of the woods, as if waiting for something. He became convinced that they were indeed planning an escape, and he decided to act before they could put their plan into motion. On the evening of August 14th, as the sun dipped below the tree-line and the air cooled slightly, Thorne made his move. He gathered a group of trusted men, 2 other overseers named Dalton and Harris, and 3 hired hands who worked on the plantation as general laborers. He armed them with clubs and ropes and led them to the quarters just as the enslaved community was settling in for the night. The raid was swift and brutal. Thorne and his men burst into the cabins, shouting orders and dragging people out into the narrow lane. They searched for Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, pulling them from their sleeping spaces and binding their hands with rough hemp rope. The other enslaved people watched in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches, as the 4 accused were lined up in the center of the lane. Thorne stood before them, his face twisted with anger and satisfaction. He accused them of conspiracy to escape, of plotting against the plantation, of betraying the trust that Samuel Hargrove had placed in them. He did not offer them a chance to defend themselves or to explain. He had already decided their fate. The kennels were located on the far edge of the plantation, near the tree-line where the cultivated land gave way to wilderness. They were crude structures, little more than wooden pens with chain-link fencing, designed to house the hunting dogs that Hargrove used for tracking game and occasionally runaway slaves. The kennels had been built several years earlier when Hargrove had decided to invest in a pack of dogs for hunting and security purposes. The structures were functional but poorly maintained, with rusted hinges and gaps in the fencing that had been patched with wire and scrap wood. There were 6 dogs in total, large, muscular animals with short coats and powerful jaws. They were a mix of breeds, primarily bloodhounds and curs, chosen for their tracking ability and their aggression. The dogs were kept in a state of perpetual hunger and stress, fed irregularly and beaten when they failed to perform as expected. They lived in filthy conditions, their pens rarely cleaned, and they had learned to associate humans with pain and deprivation. They were not pets or companions. They were tools, weapons to be deployed when needed and ignored the rest of the time. Thorne ordered the 4 accused to be taken to the kennels. The other enslaved people watched in horror as Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel were marched across the property, their hands still bound, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. The night was thick with humidity, and the sound of cicadas filled the air, a constant droning that seemed to amplify the tension. As they walked, Esther began to hum softly, a melody that the others recognized as an old spiritual, a song of hope and endurance. Thomas and Samuel joined in, their voices low but steady, and even Jacob, who rarely sang, added his voice to the chorus. When they reached the kennels, Thorn gave the order. The gates were opened, and the four were shoved inside, their ropes cut so that their hands were free, but their options were limited. The dogs, which had been lying in the shadows at the back of the pen, immediately rose to their feet, their ears pricked forward, their bodies tense. The gate was slammed shut and locked, and Thorn and his men stepped back, forming a semicircle around the kennel to watch what would happen next. What happened next defied all logic and expectation. The dogs did not attack. Instead, they circled the four people slowly, sniffing the air and the ground, their ears flattened against their heads. Jacob stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the nearest dog, a massive brindled hound with scars across its muzzle and a notch missing from one ear. The dog approached cautiously, its nose twitching as it caught Jacob's scent. Jacob did not move. He did not raise his hands or make any sudden gestures. He simply stood there, breathing slowly and evenly, allowing the dog to assess him on its own terms. Esther pressed her back against the fence, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had never been this close to the dogs before, and the sight of their powerful bodies and sharp teeth filled her with terror. But she forced herself to remain still, remembering Jacob's quiet instructions during their planning meetings. He had told them that if they ever found themselves in danger from animals, the key was to avoid triggering their predatory instincts. No running, no screaming, no sudden movements, just stillness and calm. Thomas and Samuel stood shoulder to shoulder, their fists clenched despite the absence of ropes. They watched the dogs with a mixture of fear and defiance, ready to fight if necessary, but hoping it would not come to that. Samuel's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, a rapid drumbeat that seemed to drown out all other sounds. Thomas placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity and support. The brindled hound finished sniffing Jacob and took a step back, its tail lowering slightly. It tilted its head to one side, as if trying to understand what it was seeing. Jacob slowly extended one hand, palm down, allowing the dog to sniff it. The dog approached again, more cautiously this time, and touched its nose to Jacob's hand. Jacob remained motionless, his breathing steady, his expression calm. After a moment, the dog's tail gave a small wag, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Another dog, a lean black animal with a white patch on its chest, approached Esther. She fought the urge to shrink away, forcing herself to stand still as the dog sniffed her legs and then her hands. The dog's breath was hot and rank, and Esther could see the ribs protruding beneath its thin coat. She felt a sudden surge of pity for the animal, recognizing in it the same suffering and deprivation that she and her people endured every day. Without thinking, she whispered softly, "It's all right. I won't hurt you." The dog's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. It looked up at her face, its dark eyes meeting hers, and for a moment there was a connection, a recognition of shared suffering, of mutual vulnerability. The dog's tail wagged once, twice, and then it lowered itself to the ground at Esther's feet, resting its head on its paws. The remaining dogs approached Thomas and Samuel, circling them warily. One of the dogs, a reddish-brown hound with a scarred flank, growled low in its throat, and Samuel tensed, preparing for an attack. But Thomas spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "Easy now. We're not here to hurt you. Easy." The growling stopped. The dog took a step closer, sniffing Samuel's leg, and then moved on to Thomas. It circled them both, its movement slow and deliberate, and then it too lowered itself to the ground. The other dogs followed suit, one by one, until all 6 animals were lying down, forming a loose perimeter around the 4 people, but making no move to harm them. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sounds were the cicadas in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft breathing of the dogs. Jacob slowly lowered himself to a sitting position, his back against the fence, his movements careful and deliberate. The brindled hound watched him but did not react. Esther followed his lead, sinking down to the ground with the black dog still resting at her feet. Thomas and Samuel remained standing for a few more minutes, their eyes scanning the kennel, and then they too sat down, their backs against the opposite fence. Outside the kennel, Garrett Thorne stood frozen, his face twisted in confusion and fury. He had expected screams, blood, the sounds of tearing flesh and breaking bones. He had expected the dogs to do what they had been trained to do, to attack without hesitation, to eliminate the threat, to serve as instruments of his will. But the dogs had refused. They had not only refused to attack, they had actively chosen to lie down, to submit, to reject the role that had been assigned to them. Thorne shouted commands at the dogs, ordering them to attack. But the animals did not respond. They remained where they were, their eyes half closed, their bodies relaxed. Thorne picked up a stick and rattled it against the fence, trying to provoke them, but they did not move. He fired his pistol into the air, the sharp crack echoing across the plantation, but the dogs merely flinched and then settled back down. The other men with Thorne exchanged uneasy glances. Dalton, one of the overseers, muttered something about the dogs being sick or drugged. Harris suggested that maybe the four people had some kind of charm or spell that was protecting them. The hired hand said nothing, but their expressions betrayed their discomfort. This was not how things were supposed to go. The natural order had been disrupted, and no one knew what to do about it. Thorne's frustration mounted with each passing minute. He paced back and forth in front of the kennel, his hands clenching and unclenching, his mind racing. He considered shooting the four people himself, but something held him back, perhaps the presence of witnesses, or perhaps a flicker of superstition that even he could not entirely suppress. The scene was too strange, too inexplicable. It felt wrong in a way that went beyond simple disobedience. It felt like a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that governed his world, a suggestion that the power he wielded was not as absolute as he had believed. As the night wore on, the dogs remained calm. They did not growl or bare their teeth. They did not pace or show signs of agitation. Instead, they seemed almost protective, positioning themselves between the four people and the fence as if guarding them from the men outside. At one point, the brindled hound rose to its feet and walked over to Jacob, sniffing his face and then licking his hand. Jacob reached out slowly and scratched the dog behind the ears, and the animal leaned into the touch, its eyes closing in what looked like contentment. Esther watched this interaction with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. She had never seen a dog behave this way, had never imagined that such a connection was possible between human and animal. In a place like this, she thought about the stories her mother had told her, stories about a time before slavery, when people and animals had lived in harmony, when the natural world had been a source of sustenance and companionship rather than danger and exploitation. She wondered if what she was witnessing was a glimpse of that lost world, a reminder that even in the darkest places, there was the possibility of compassion and connection. By midnight, Thorne had had enough. He ordered the gates to be locked and the torches extinguished. He told the other men to return to their quarters and to speak of this to no one. He himself retreated to the overseer's house, a small structure near the main house where he lived alone. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk, staring out the window toward the kennels, trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and drank it quickly, then poured another. His mind churned with questions and doubts, with anger and confusion. He had built his entire identity on his ability to control, to dominate, to enforce his will through fear and violence. But tonight, that power had been challenged in a way he could not understand or accept. As dawn approached, the sky began to lighten, shifting from deep black to dark blue to pale gray. The cicadas fell silent, replaced by the chirping of early morning birds. The plantation began to stir, with people emerging from the quarters to begin another day of labor. Thorne rose from his desk, his eyes bloodshot and his face haggard, and walked back to the kennels. The dogs were still there, still calm, still positioned around the four people. Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel were exhausted but unharmed. They had spent the night sitting or lying on the ground, dozing fitfully, always aware of the dog's presence but no longer afraid. When Thorn appeared at the gate, the dogs rose to their feet, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on him. For a moment, Thorn thought they might attack him, and he took an involuntary step backward, but the dogs did not move toward him. They simply stood there, forming a barrier between him and the four people. Thorn unlocked the gate and ordered Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel to come out. They rose slowly, their muscles stiff from the long night, and walked toward the gate. The dogs watched them go but did not follow. As the four people stepped out of the kennel, the brindled hound let out a low whine, a sound that was almost mournful. Jacob paused and looked back at the dog, and for a moment their eyes met. Then Jacob turned away and followed the others back toward the quarters. Thorn locked the gate behind them and stood there for a long moment, staring at the dogs. They had returned to their resting positions, lying on the ground with their heads on their paws, but their eyes remained open, watching him. Thorn felt a chill run down his spine, a sensation he had not experienced in years. He turned and walked away, his mind still churning with unanswered questions. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the story of the Harov plantation intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Over the following days, strange things began to happen on the Harov plantation. The dogs, once fierce and obedient, became unpredictable. They refused to respond to Thorn's commands. They would not hunt. They would not track. When Thorn tried to force them into the woods for a training exercise, they simply sat down and refused to move. It was as if something had broken inside them, some fundamental part of their training that could not be restored. Thorn grew increasingly paranoid. He began to suspect that Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel had somehow bewitched the animals, though he could not explain how or why. He questioned them repeatedly, demanding to know what they had done. But they gave him no answers. They simply stared at him with expressions that were neither defiant nor submissive, just blank, unreadable. Jacob, in particular, seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if Thorn were not even worth acknowledging. The other enslaved people on the plantation began to whisper among themselves. They spoke of the night in the kennels as if it were a miracle, a sign that even the cruelest instruments of oppression could be turned against their masters. The story spread quickly, passed from person to person in hushed tones during the brief moments when they were out of earshot of the overseers. Some saw it as evidence of divine intervention, a demonstration that God had not abandoned them despite their suffering. Others saw it as proof that the natural world itself could rebel against injustice, that animals possessed a moral sense that humans sometimes lacked. Peter, the man who had informed on Jacob and the others, was consumed by guilt. He could not sleep, could not eat, could not look his fellow workers in the eye. He had expected the four to be killed, had believed that his betrayal would result in their deaths, and that he would have to carry that burden for the rest of his life. But they had survived, and their survival felt like an accusation, a constant reminder of his weakness and cowardice. He began to avoid them, taking circuitous routes through the plantation to ensure he would not cross their paths, but he could not escape the weight of what he had done. One evening, about a week after the incident in the kennels, Peter approached Esther as she was tending her garden. He stood at the edge of the small plot, his hands twisting nervously, his eyes fixed on the ground. Esther looked up from her work, her expression neutral, and waited for him to speak. "I'm sorry," Peter said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for what I did. I was scared. Thorn, he threatened me, and I didn't know what else to do." Esther studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she returned her attention to the plants, pulling weeds and adjusting the soil around the roots. "You made your choice," she said quietly. "We all make choices. Some we can live with, some we can't. Peter nodded, his shoulders sagging. He wanted to say more, to explain, to justify, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would change what had happened. He turned and walked away, leaving Esther to her work. Meanwhile, Thorne's obsession with restoring order intensified. He tried everything he could think of to regain control of the dogs. He starved them, hoping that hunger would reawaken their aggression. He beat them, hoping that pain would force them back into submission. He brought in a trainer from a neighboring plantation, a man who claimed to have experience with difficult animals. But even he could not make the dogs respond. They remained docile, almost lethargic, as if they had lost all interest in the world around them. The trainer, a grizzled man named Horace, spent 3 days working with the dogs before giving up. He told Thorne that the animals had been broken in some fundamental way, that whatever had happened in the kennels that night had damaged them beyond repair. "It's like they've lost their spirit," Horace said, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like it. You might as well put them down and start over with a new pack." Thorne considered this advice, but he was reluctant to follow it. The dogs represented a significant investment, and he did not want to admit defeat. He also could not shake the feeling that there was something more going on, something he did not understand. He began to spend hours watching the dogs, studying their behavior, trying to find some clue that would explain what had happened. One afternoon, as Thorne stood outside the kennels, Jacob walked past on his way to the carpentry shop. Thorne called out to him, ordering him to stop. Jacob paused and turned to face him, his expression calm and patient. "What did you do to them?" Thorne demanded, gesturing toward the dogs. "What did you do that night?" Jacob looked at the dogs, then back at Thorne. "I didn't do anything," he said simply. "I just didn't give them a reason to hurt me." "That's not an answer," Thorne snapped. "Those dogs are trained killers. They should have torn you apart. But they didn't." "Why?" Jacob was silent for a moment, considering his response. Then he said, "Maybe they're tired of being killers. Maybe they wanted something different." Thorne stared at him, his jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. He wanted to strike Jacob, to force him to give a better answer, but something held him back. There was a quiet dignity in Jacob's demeanor, a sense of self-possession that Thorne found deeply unsettling. He waved Jacob away dismissively and turned back to the kennels, his mind still churning with frustration and confusion. As the days passed, the atmosphere on the plantation grew increasingly tense. The enslaved community sensed that something had shifted, that the balance of power had been disrupted in some subtle but significant way. They did not speak openly about it, but they felt it, a new sense of possibility, a flicker of hope that had not been there before. They worked as they always had, following orders and avoiding punishment. But there was a new energy beneath the surface, a quiet determination that had not existed before the night in the kennels. Thorne, meanwhile, became more erratic and unpredictable. He lashed out at workers for minor infractions, imposing harsh punishments for perceived slights. He increased the workload, extending the hours in the fields and cutting rations even further. He seemed determined to reassert his authority, to prove that he was still in control, but his efforts only served to deepen the resentment and fear that permeated the plantation. 2 weeks after the incident in the kennels, Samuel Hargrove returned from Savannah. He had been away for nearly a month, attending to business matters and socializing with other planters. When he arrived back at the plantation, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The atmosphere was different, more tense, more charged. He summoned Thorne to the main house and demanded an explanation. Thorne tried to downplay the situation, describing the incident in the kennels as a minor disruption that he had handled appropriately. But Hargrove was not satisfied. He had heard rumors during his time in Savannah, whispers about strange happenings on his plantation, about dogs that refused to attack, about enslaved people who had somehow survived an ordeal that should have killed them. The stories had reached the ears of other planters, and they had begun to question Hargrove's ability to maintain order on his own property. Hargrove was furious. He confronted Thorne in his study, his voice cold and controlled. "You have made me look like a fool," he said. "You have allowed a situation to develop that has become the subject of gossip and speculation throughout the county. This is unacceptable." Thorne tried to defend himself, insisting that he had done what was necessary to maintain discipline, but Hargrove cut him off. "You have failed," he said flatly. "The dogs are useless. The workers are restless, and my reputation has been damaged. I cannot afford to keep you on as overseer." Thorne's face went pale. "You're dismissing me." "I am relieving you of your duties," Hargrove said. "You will leave the plantation by the end of the week. I will provide you with a letter of reference, but I suggest you seek employment elsewhere, preferably in another county." Thorne left the study in a daze, his mind reeling. He had built his entire identity around his position as overseer, around his ability to control and dominate. To be dismissed was not just a professional setback, it was a personal humiliation, a repudiation of everything he believed about himself. He returned to his quarters and began packing his belongings, his movements mechanical, his thoughts dark and bitter. On his last day at the plantation, Thorne took one final walk around the property. He stopped at the kennels and looked at the dogs, which were lying in the shade, their eyes half closed. They did not acknowledge his presence. He thought about shooting them, about destroying the evidence of his failure, but he did not have the energy or the will. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the dogs behind. As Thorne rode away from the Hargrove plantation, heading south toward the coast, he carried with him a sense of unfinished business, a gnawing feeling that he had been defeated by forces he could not understand or control. He would never return to the county, and he would never speak of what had happened in the kennels that August night, but the memory would haunt him for the rest of his life, a constant reminder that power was not as absolute as he had believed, that there were limits to what could be forced, boundaries that could not be crossed, no matter how much authority one wielded. As for Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, their fate was more ambiguous and more tragic. Samuel Hargrove did not punish them further for the escape attempt. He recognized that doing so would only draw more attention to the incident and fuel more gossip. But he also could not allow them to remain together, to continue to represent a challenge to his authority. He made the decision to separate them, to scatter them across the plantation, and eventually to sell some of them away. Within a month of Thorne's departure, Thomas and Samuel were sold to a trader named William Gaines, who was assembling a coffle of enslaved people to be transported west toward Alabama and Mississippi. The sale was conducted quickly and quietly, with minimal documentation. Thomas and Samuel were given no warning, no chance to say goodbye to the people they had lived and worked with for years. They were simply taken from the fields one afternoon, their hands bound, and marched to a holding pen near the main road where Gaines was gathering his human cargo. The night before they were to leave, Esther managed to slip away from her work and make her way to the holding pen. She brought with her a small bundle of food, cornbread and dried meat, and a pouch of herbs that she pressed into Thomas's hands. "For fevers and infections," she whispered. "Keep it hidden. It might save your life someday." Thomas nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He and Samuel had known this day would come, had understood that their survival in the kennels had only delayed the inevitable, but the reality of it was still devastating. "Take care of yourself," Thomas said to Esther, "and tell Jacob, tell him we're grateful for everything." Esther nodded, unable to speak. She reached through the bars of the pen and squeezed Samuel's hand, then turned and walked away before the guards could see her. She did not look back. The next morning, Thomas and Samuel were chained together and added to the coffle, a line of nearly 30 enslaved people who would be marched hundreds of miles to the west. The journey would take weeks, and many would not survive it. Thomas and Samuel walked side by side, their faces set in expressions of grim determination, their minds focused on the simple goal of staying alive. They carried with them the memory of the night in the kennels, the memory of the dogs that had refused to kill them. And they drew strength from that memory, even as they faced an uncertain and terrifying future. The trail of Thomas and Samuel went cold after they reached Alabama. There were no further records of their sale, no documentation of their lives or deaths. It was as if they had simply vanished into the vast and brutal machinery of the slave trade, 2 more lives swallowed up by a system that treated human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. Esther remained on the Harrove plantation, but her life became increasingly difficult. Samuel Hargrove, still smarting from the embarrassment of the kennel incident, decided to reassign her from fieldwork to domestic service in the main house. On the surface, this might have seemed like an improvement. Domestic workers were generally better fed and housed than field hands. But in reality, it was a form of punishment. Esther was now under constant supervision, her every movement watched and monitored. She was separated from the community she had served as healer and storyteller, isolated in the main house where she had to navigate the complex and often hostile dynamics of the household staff. The work was grueling in a different way than field labor. Esther was expected to be available at all hours, to anticipate the needs of the Hargrove family before they were even expressed, to endure insults and abuse without complaint. She was assigned to work under the head housekeeper, a free black woman named Margaret, who had internalized the plantation's hierarchies and who treated the enslaved domestic workers with contempt and cruelty. Margaret saw Esther as a threat, a woman with knowledge and authority within the enslaved community, and she made it her mission to break Esther's spirit. But Esther endured. She had survived too much, had witnessed too many losses to be broken. She performed her duties with quiet efficiency, keeping her thoughts and feelings hidden behind a mask of compliance. At night, when she was finally allowed to rest, she would lie on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters and think about the night in the kennels, about the dogs that had refused to attack, about the strange and inexplicable mercy that had been shown to her and her companions. She thought about Thomas and Samuel, wondering if they were still alive, if they were still together, if they remembered that night as vividly as she did. Esther's health began to decline in the years following the kennel incident. The stress of her new position, combined with the accumulated toll of decades of hard labor and inadequate nutrition, weakened her body. She developed a persistent cough that would not go away, and she began to lose weight. Margaret showed no sympathy, insisting that Esther continue to work even when she was clearly ill. Samuel Hargrove, when informed of Esther's condition, simply shrugged and said that she could be replaced if necessary. In the winter of 1851, Esther's condition worsened dramatically. The cough became more severe, accompanied by fever and chest pain. She was finally allowed to rest, but by then it was too late. She died on a cold January morning, alone in the servants' quarters, her body worn out by a lifetime of suffering and exploitation. She was buried in the slave cemetery on the edge of the property. Her grave was marked only by a wooden cross that bore no name, no dates, no acknowledgement of the life she had lived or the people she had helped. Jacob remained on the Harrove plantation longer than any of the others. He continued to work in the carpentry shop, repairing buildings and constructing new structures as needed. He was a valuable asset to the plantation, and Samuel Hargrove was reluctant to sell him. But Jacob was never the same after the night in the kennels. He spoke less, worked mechanically, and seemed to carry a weight that no one else could see. He had lost his companions, the people who had shared his dream of freedom, and the loss had hollowed him out in some fundamental way. Jacob thought often about the dogs, about the strange connection he had felt with them that night. He had spent years working with dogs on the Dalton plantation in Virginia, and he had always believed that animals were capable of compassion and loyalty, that they could form genuine bonds with humans. But what had happened in the kennels had been different. It had not been about training or conditioning. It had been about recognition, about a shared understanding of suffering and vulnerability. The dogs had seen in Jacob and his companions something that transcended the roles they had been assigned, and they had chosen to respond with mercy rather than violence. In the years following the incident, Jacob began to develop a quiet philosophy, a way of understanding the world that helped him make sense of his experiences. He came to believe that there were limits to what could be forced, that even the most brutal systems of control could not completely erase the capacity for compassion and connection. He believed that the dogs had taught him something important, that resistance did not always have to be loud or violent, that sometimes the most powerful form of resistance was simply refusing to participate in cruelty, choosing mercy over violence even when violence was expected. Jacob shared these thoughts with a few trusted individuals on the plantation, speaking in quiet conversations during the brief moments of rest. He did not preach or proselytize. He simply offered his perspective, his understanding, and he left it to others to decide what to make of it. Some dismissed his ideas as naive or impractical, but others found comfort and inspiration in them. They began to see the night in the kennels not as an isolated incident but as a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there was the possibility of unexpected grace. The Civil War came to Georgia in 1864, bringing with it chaos and destruction. Union forces swept through the state, burning plantations and liberating enslaved people. The Harrove plantation was not spared. The main house was set ablaze during Sherman's march to the sea, and the fields were left to grow over with weeds. Samuel Hargrove fled to Savannah, taking with him whatever valuables he could carry, and he never returned. Jacob was in his early 50s by then, his body worn down by decades of hard labor. When the Union soldiers arrived and announced that slavery had been abolished, Jacob felt a strange mixture of emotions, relief, disbelief, and a profound sadness for all the years that had been stolen from him. He left the plantation on foot, carrying nothing but a small bundle of belongings, and walked north toward the mountains. The journey was difficult. Jacob was not as strong as he had once been, and the roads were crowded with other freedmen and refugees, all searching for safety and opportunity. He traveled slowly, stopping frequently to rest, and he relied on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. Along the way, he met other people who had been enslaved, and he shared his story with them, the story of the night in the kennels, the story of the dogs that had refused to kill. Some had heard versions of the story before, passed down through the years, and they listened with rapt attention as Jacob filled in the details they had never known. Jacob eventually settled in a small community in the mountains of northern Georgia, a place where freedmen had begun to build new lives for themselves. He found work as a carpenter, using the skills he had developed over the years to build homes and furniture for his neighbors. He lived in a small cabin near a creek, a simple structure that he had built with his own hands, and he kept to himself for the most part, content with the quiet solitude of his new life. But Jacob did not forget the dogs. He carved a small wooden figure, a crude representation of the brindled hound that had been the first to approach him in the kennels, and he kept it on a shelf in his cabin. When visitors asked about it, he would smile and say, "They were good dogs, better than most people." He never elaborated, never told the full story unless someone pressed him. But the carving was a constant reminder of that night, a symbol of the unexpected mercy that had saved his life. Jacob lived for another 7 years after the end of the war. He died in 1872 at the age of 60, his body finally giving out after a lifetime of hard labor and deprivation. He was buried in a small cemetery near his cabin, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross. The people in the community remembered him as a quiet, thoughtful man who had endured great suffering but who had never lost his capacity for compassion and hope. The dogs, meanwhile, were eventually put down. Samuel Hargrove, before he fled the plantation, had given orders for the animals to be destroyed. They had become useless, incapable of performing the tasks they had been trained for, and Hargrove could not afford to keep them. The dogs were shot one by one and buried in a shallow grave near the treeline, their bodies covered with dirt and left to decompose. The kennels were dismantled, the wood salvaged for other projects, and the site was left to grow over with weeds and wild grass. But the story of the dogs did not die with them. It lived on in the memories of the people who had witnessed the events of that August night, and it was passed down through generations, told and retold in different forms. The story spread beyond the Harrove plantation, carried by traders and travelers who passed through the area, and it became part of the folklore of northern Georgia. In the decades following the Civil War, as the formerly enslaved people began to build new lives and communities, the story of the kennels took on new meanings. For some, it was a story about the power of compassion and the limits of cruelty. For others, it was a story about resistance and survival, about the ways that people and animals could refuse to participate in systems of oppression. And for still others, it was simply a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was the possibility of unexpected grace, of connections that transcended the brutal hierarchies of slavery. The story was told in churches and community gatherings, in conversations between grandparents and grandchildren, in letters and memoirs written by people who had lived through the era of slavery. Each telling added new details or emphasized different aspects, but the core remained the same, for people had been thrown to the dogs, and the dogs had refused to kill them. In the 1890s, a historian named Margaret Callaway began researching the history of slavery in northern Georgia. She was particularly interested in stories of resistance and survival, and she had heard rumors of the incident at the Harrove plantation. She traveled to the area and spent months interviewing elderly residents, many of whom had been enslaved during the antebellum period. She combed through county records, plantation ledgers, and personal letters, piecing together fragments of information. What she discovered was both illuminating and heartbreaking. According to several testimonies, Jacob had been a dog handler on a previous plantation in Virginia. He had worked with hunting dogs for years, training them, caring for them, and learning their behaviors. When he was sold to the Harrove plantation, he had brought that knowledge with him. He knew how to read a dog's body language, how to calm an agitated animal, and how to establish trust, even in the most hostile circumstances. On the night he was thrown into the kennels, Jacob had not panicked. Instead, he had used every skill he had learned over the years. He had stood still, avoiding sudden movements that might trigger an attack. He had spoken softly, using a low, steady voice that the dogs would recognize as non-threatening. He had allowed them to approach him on their own terms, to sniff him and assess him without feeling pressured. And slowly, carefully, he had won them over. Esther, Thomas, and Samuel had followed his lead. They had trusted him even in the face of almost certain death, and they had remained calm. The dogs, sensing no aggression or fear, had responded in kind. They had not attacked because there was nothing to attack, only 4 people who posed no threat, who smelled of sweat and exhaustion and desperation, but not of violence. It was not a miracle. It was not magic. It was simply the result of one man's knowledge and the willingness of 3 others to trust him in the darkest moment of their lives. But there was more to the story. Callaway also uncovered evidence that the dogs on the Harrove plantation had been mistreated for years. They had been starved, beaten, and forced to live in squalid conditions. They had been trained to kill, but they had also been conditioned to associate humans with pain and suffering. When they encountered Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, people who did not hurt them, who did not shout at them or strike them, they responded with something that resembled relief. For the first time in their lives, they were in the presence of humans who did not want to harm them. In a way, the dogs had chosen compassion over cruelty. They had refused to perpetuate the cycle of violence that had defined their existence. And in doing so, they had saved 4 lives and inspired countless others. Callaway's research did not end with the discovery of Jacob's skills as a dog handler. She continued to dig deeper, searching for any trace of what had happened to the 4 people after they were separated. She found records of Thomas and Samuel being sold to a plantation in Alabama, but the trail went cold after that. There were no further sales, no death certificates, no mention of them in any surviving documents. It was as if they had simply vanished. Esther's fate was slightly clearer. Callaway found a notation in the Hargrove plantation ledger indicating that she had died in 1851, 4 years after the incident in the kennels. The cause of death was listed as fever, a vague term that could have meant anything from malaria to typhoid to simple exhaustion. She was buried in the slave cemetery on the edge of the property, her grave marked only by a wooden cross that had long since rotted away. Jacob's story was the most difficult to trace. He remained on the Hargrove plantation until 1865, when the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. He was in his early 50s by then, his body worn down by decades of hard labor. According to one account, he left the plantation on foot, carrying nothing but a small bundle of belongings, and walked north toward the mountains. No one knew where he went or what became of him. Some believed he had died on the road, too weak to complete the journey. Others thought he might have found a community of freedmen and lived out his remaining years in relative peace. But Calloway found one final piece of evidence that suggested a different ending. In a collection of letters donated to a historical society in Atlanta, she discovered a letter written in 1872 by a schoolteacher in the mountains of northern Georgia. The teacher described meeting an elderly black man who had settled in a small cabin near a creek. The man was quiet and kept to himself, but he was known in the area for his skill with animals. He could calm a spooked horse with a few words, train a dog to obey without ever raising his voice, and coax wild birds to eat from his hand. The teacher did not mention the man's name, but she noted that he had scars on his wrists, old scars, she said, that looked like they had been made by ropes. She also mentioned that he kept a small wooden carving on a shelf in his cabin, a crude figure of a dog that he had whittled himself. When she asked him about it, he simply smiled and said, "They were good dogs, better than most people." Calloway believed that the man in the letter was Jacob. She could not prove it beyond a doubt, but the details matched too closely to be a coincidence. If she was right, then Jacob had survived. He had lived long enough to see the end of slavery, to walk away from the plantation that had held him captive for so many years, and to build a life, however small and solitary, on his own terms. The Harrove plantation itself did not survive the Civil War. Samuel Hargrove died in 1863, and his heirs sold the property to pay off debts. The main house was burned during Sherman's march to the sea, and the land was eventually divided and sold to smaller farmers. By the turn of the century, there was little left to indicate that the plantation had ever existed. The fields grew over with weeds, the slave quarters collapsed into piles of rotting wood, and the forest reclaimed the land. But the story of the kennels lived on. It was passed down through generations, told and retold in different forms. Some versions were embellished with supernatural elements, ghostly dogs that still roamed the woods, or a curse that had been placed on Garrett Thorne. Other versions stripped away the details, reducing the story to a simple moral lesson about the power of compassion and the limits of cruelty. In the 1920s, a journalist named Harold Finch traveled to the area to investigate the legend. He interviewed several elderly residents who claimed to have heard the story from their grandparents. One woman, a former slave named Clara, told him that her grandmother had been on the Harrove plantation the night of the incident. She remembered her grandmother describing the scene in vivid detail, the torches, the shouting, the dogs lying down instead of attacking. Clara said her grandmother had always believed that the dogs had understood something that the humans did not, that the four people in the kennels were not their enemies. Finch also visited the site of the old plantation. He found the remains of the main house, now little more than a blackened foundation overgrown with ivy. He walked through the fields, searching for any trace of the kennels, but found nothing. The forest had swallowed everything. He stood at the edge of the tree line, listening to the wind rustling through the pines, and tried to imagine what it must have been like on that August night in 1847. He wrote an article about his findings, but it was never published. The editor of the newspaper he worked for deemed the story too controversial, too difficult to verify. Finch's notes and drafts were eventually donated to a university archive, where they sat unread for decades. In the 1970s, a graduate student named David Lawson stumbled across Finch's notes while researching a thesis on slave resistance in the antebellum South. He was intrigued by the story and decided to investigate further. He tracked down Margaret Calloway's research, which had been preserved in a small historical society in Georgia, and he conducted his own interviews with descendants of people who had been enslaved on the Harrove plantation. What Lawson discovered was that the story of the kennels had become a symbol of resistance and survival within the black community in northern Georgia. It was not just a tale of four people who had been spared by dogs. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was the possibility of unexpected mercy, of connections that transcended the brutal hierarchies of slavery. Lawson also found evidence that the story had influenced other enslaved people in the region. In the years following the incident, there were several reports of slaves using similar tactics to avoid punishment or escape capture. They would remain calm in the presence of dogs, speaking softly and avoiding sudden movements. And in some cases, the dogs would refuse to attack. It was as if Jacob's knowledge had spread, passed from person to person in whispered conversations, becoming a small but significant tool of survival. Lawson's thesis was published in 1978, and it brought renewed attention to the story. Historians began to re-examine the incident, looking for new sources and perspectives. Some argued that the story had been exaggerated over time, that the dogs had simply been too tired or too poorly trained to attack. Others insisted that the story was essentially true, that it represented a genuine moment of compassion in a system defined by cruelty. But the debate missed the point. Whether the dogs had been influenced by Jacob's skills, by their own mistreatment, or by some combination of factors, the fact remained that they had refused to kill. They had chosen not to participate in the violence that was expected of them. And in doing so, they had saved 4 lives and inspired countless others. Today, the site of the Horove plantation is a quiet stretch of forest and farmland. There are no markers, no plaques, no signs to indicate what happened there. The kennels are long gone, the main house is a memory, and the people who lived and died on that land have been forgotten by most of the world. But the story endures. It is told in classrooms and community centers, in books and documentaries, in conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. It is a story about the limits of power, about the unexpected ways that compassion can manifest, and about the resilience of people who refuse to be broken by the system that sought to destroy them. And it is a story that asks a question that still resonates today. In a world built on cruelty and oppression, what does it mean when even the instruments of that cruelty refuse to obey? The answer, perhaps, is that there are limits to what can be forced, boundaries that cannot be crossed, no matter how much power one wields. The dogs in the kennels that night recognized something in Jacob, Esther, Thomas, and Samuel, something that transcended the roles they had been assigned, the labels they had been given. They saw people, not property, and they chose to act accordingly. It is a small moment in the vast and brutal history of slavery in America, but it is a moment worth remembering, because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, there is the possibility of unexpected grace, of connections that defy the logic of oppression, of choices that affirm our shared humanity. The legacy of that night in August 1847 extends far beyond the 4 individuals who survived it. It lives on in the stories that were passed down, in the tactics that were shared, in the hope that was kindled in the hearts of people who had every reason to despair. It lives on in the memory of dogs that chose compassion over violence, that refused to be instruments of cruelty even when they had been trained for that purpose. And it lives on in the questions it raises about power and resistance, about the nature of cruelty and the possibility of mercy, about the ways that even the most oppressive systems contain within them the seeds of their own undoing. Because when the dogs refused to attack, they demonstrated something fundamental, that obedience is not absolute, that conditioning can be overcome, that there are limits to what can be forced even in the most brutal circumstances. This is the true horror and the true hope of the story, not the violence that was expected, but the mercy that was given, not the cruelty that was commanded, but the compassion that was chosen. It is a reminder that in every system of oppression, there are moments when the machinery breaks down, when the instruments refuse to function as designed, when unexpected connections are formed that transcend the logic of domination. The story of the Horove plantation kennels is not just a historical curiosity or a piece of folklore. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the capacity for compassion that exists even in the most unlikely places. It is a reminder that history is not just a record of cruelty and suffering, but also of moments when grace broke through the darkness, when mercy triumphed over violence, when the expected order of things was disrupted by acts of unexpected kindness. This mystery shows us that history is not just a record of cruelty and suffering, but also of moments when compassion broke through the darkness. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next one.